one of the theories is that at the moment we have 6.7 billion people roughly in the world. It's going to 9.1 billion. But all of the experts then show that it's going to drop off. This is always in the graphs of the future. It actually never happens. It's tied up with the fact that when people get educated, they have less kids. And so he says the problem's going to be is this reducing number, and that's going to be our problem. Most people don't agree with him. And I can tell you, the best thing we can do for climate change is to put funding into developing countries to educate women. Because when women have the freedom to control their fertility, they make sensible decisions. And that's what we've got to do. My film team and I are going to Bangladesh to look at a group there. My director wanted me to hold up a condom, but I've agreed to hold up the pill. And to say, if you want to do something about global warming, this is the way of reducing global warming that's most effective. Allow people to have control of their fertility, and we'll be able to do something really worthwhile for climate change and for the future of people on this planet. So I agree with you, mate. And by the way, Australia should be putting a larger amount of money into allowing the various organisations that can teach family planning to developing countries. We should be putting lots more money into that, because that's very important for the world.
Okay, thank you. When I've talked to some of my colleagues about this problem, while global warming is a problem, the rich countries say, well, it's a population problem, and the poor countries say it's not a population problem, the problem is the power consumption. I guess this room is a good example where there are fans going everywhere, and there's an electric, air conditioner here. And so the rich countries say it's a population problem, the poor countries say, no, it's the amount of power you're consuming. You're talking about not having enough food to eat. Well, they said, well, eat more, grains and vegetables and not meat. And so you can see it from both ways, and so you didn't mention the other way, so could you make some comments about that?
Yes, I mean, what people could say is that we can solve or help solve the climate change problem by having less material wealth, and there's no doubt about that. If we became vegetarian, we're certainly going to help climate change, but do we really have to do that? We will have to do it if we're going to increase our population, but possibly we can have our cake and eat it too, and we're selfish. I mean, the only reason we have borders are for self-interest. I happen to believe, and this will be controversial, that every person should have the same right to the world's resources. Fortunately for us, in a wealthy country, every country has borders, so we can rationalise it's okay. And don't get me wrong, I don't want to take away borders because I'm selfish. I like to keep our own culture, our own standard of living and so forth. But they're basically unjust. So the fairest thing we can do is to try and facilitate that people who don't have enough food to eat do have enough food to eat. So basically my answer is, yes, we could have a major effect on climate change by substantially lowering our standard of living, our material standard of living. I don't think that's going to happen, unfortunately. I don't think people are prepared to do that. But when it comes to having a population policy, that's not too difficult, I don't think. And most people, if they see some figures that show that their children may not have enough food to eat in their old age, they'll make the correct decision. Thank you.
Oh, sorry, over here first.
No.
Thanks for your talk. Thanks for your talk, Dick. Very interesting. But the question was sustainable population in Australia is Kevin's nominating 35 million, you've just nominated 28. Tim Flannery, before he became Australian of the Year, was nominating 10. I think he recanted on that. So how are we going to arrive at the figure?
We get the scientists to do it. See, believe it or not, I was going to say it's not rocket science, it actually is rocket science. But if our scientists can tell us that if we increase carbon dioxide in the atmosphere by a certain percentage, we're going to have 2 degrees rise in temperature, and they can tell us that with about a 90% accuracy, surely they can tell us how many people we can sustain. Because the figures they've got for climate change can be put into the computer. We know how much food we grow now. We know how much food we want to eat. We basically have a good idea with peak oil and peak for fossil fuels. We can calculate all that. The amazing thing is, there was a study 17 years ago. Is that right? 17 years ago by...
1994.
And who was that by?
The Australian Academy of Science.
The Australian Academy of Science. And I think it said about 24 million?
23.
About 23 million, and that was 17 years or so ago, before we had the evidence we now have of climate change. With what we're doing with burning up fossil fuels into the atmosphere, it seems pretty logical to me, just using common sense alone, that if you get carbon that has been sequestered over millions of years, laid down over tens of millions, hundreds of millions of years, and burn it all up in 200 years, you're going to have an effect. Sounds to me. And if something complies, as I mentioned to you, I'm simply a car radio installer. So I have to bring things back to common sense. And I must tell you, most of my right-wing business mates are so-called global skeptics or global warming deniers. I think they're kidding themselves, and they're utterly selfish because they know it can't affect them. They're all my age or older. Well, if it's a problem, it will be our grandchildren will have to solve it, not us. And that's very, very selfish. Another question?
Oh, sorry. Yeah?
Yes.
With an aging population in developed countries, will these countries come to rely on migration of young people from developing nations to do all the work? If so, do you think we can expect a shift in government policies on migration sometime soon?
Right, well, in fact, one major point I left out, and that is the so-called Ponzi economics. We'll be told that we actually can't pay for our ageing population. And that's the reason we need a very high level of immigration. The theory is that the immigrants come in, they've normally been born, of course, they've been educated in many cases if they're skilled migrants, and we'll get the advantage of the tax they pay. Of course, it's a Ponzi scheme, because if you ever solve a problem by bringing more people at the bottom, when those people get older, you then need even more people. And I've spoken to the best economists, and they've all said to me, it's a pyramid or a Ponzi scheme. Do you know what? Dare I say it, we're going to have to pay more tax. When I was a kid, I thought, that when you worked, that money was put aside and that paid your pension. So you were owed a pension because you had paid that money. In fact, that's not so, believe it or not, that we, not only, people of my age, have not only spent the taxes we earned, we've spent more. We've borrowed from our children's future. I spoke to Paul Keating a couple of days ago, and we talked about superannuation, which he brought in. He said, Dick, it needs to be doubled. And then you need to wait a couple of generations. So the money we put aside when we're working is there to give us income as we get older. And of course, we all know that older people, to talk about retirement ages and so forth is ridiculous. Older people can be incredibly productive. And I just find it interesting when both political parties try and upstage each other when it comes to being the best on climate change, and they're all trying to deny it's going to cost us anything. Why can't we get someone who tells the truth? Kevin Rudd's a Christian. Tony Abbott is a Roman Catholic Christian. That's even better, isn't it? I don't know. Now, aren't you supposed to tell the truth? And I don't understand it, because if they said, yes, we have a terrible problem of climate change, which we're causing, and we believe it's most likely that it's going to affect us, so we're actually going to have to pay money to fix it, people would agree. I just don't understand why they say that. I thought Simon, my director, suggested that I stand for politics, and I said, yeah, I've got something to offend everybody. And one of them would be that we have to pay more tax, we have to pay more